Okay, this one is called The Mosque of Red Death. This is a story about a prince who tries to hide from a death inside a walled castle. He's joined by 1,000 of his friends. This passage describes how one night at a masquerade party, a clock begins to chime. Later in the story, at the stroke of midnight, the same clock will announce the arrival of a strange and deadly visitor. So the first thing that I want to ask about is the Mosque of Red Death. What does mosque mean? It doesn't say at the bottom of this page. It doesn't explain what mosque is, but it gives you a hint in the introduction. Second question that I want to ask you is, what does Red Death mean? Who has any ideas about that? So I'll get Mr. Skinner to pause this again, and you guys can talk about it and see whether or not you can come up with an answer just for about a minute, and then come up with an answer, and then I'll tell you what the answer is. Okay, so a mosque is a masquerade ball. That's a party, like an old-fashioned party, and I don't know whether there's a picture on the next page. I think there's a picture in your handout that shows a mosque, two people dancing at a masquerade. So often they would wear masks that cover the top part of their face, and that way people would not know who another person was, but they could see enough of them that they might say, oh, he's kind of cute, oh, she's kind of cute. But that way it was sort of how people dated back in the old days, once upon a time. So that's a masquerade, and the Red Death is actually imaginary. There wasn't a Red Death, but there was a Black Death. The Black Plague that went through all of Europe and killed, I think it killed about 1/3 of the population of the world, maybe 1/4 of the population of the world, but millions of people. Because they didn't have any antibiotics and they didn't have any good sanitation that would keep this plague at bay. So what people would do is they would lock themselves away. They would quarantine the people who were sick, and they would also quarantine themselves away from people who were sick. So kings and queens tended to hide out in castles, except in a world where transportation was difficult and where people had to rely on somebody bringing in food or bringing in supplies, clothing, all those kinds of things into a castle. You couldn't really hide from a plague. So if a person who was infected brought in clothes or food or any of those kinds of supplies, then it could get into the castle with them. It sounded like quite a wealthy prince or duke or somebody is having this party and is staying locked up inside the castle with all their friends, hoping to avoid what the poor peasants outside are suffering through. All right. There stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hands made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note that the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause, and the waltzers to cease their rotations, their evolutions. And there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and the giddiest grew pale. But then the echoes finally ceased, and a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled and made whispering vows that the next chiming of the clock would produce no similar emotion. And then, after the last lapse of 60 minutes, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and the same disconcert and meditation as before. Okay, so what we have here is a little bit of a description of the masquerade and this weird feeling. Now that's called foreshadowing. This weird feeling that something dangerous is going to come. So I'll have you write down a new definition for a term before we go any further, and that term is called foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when we get a hint of what is to come. We get a hint or an idea that leaves us either waiting in anticipation of excitement of what's going to come, or this anticipation and terror of what's going to come. It can be either way. Foreshadowing can create different emotions in us, but it should give us a strong enough hint that there's something coming, whether it's something really dark and dangerous and bad, and or whether it's something really exciting and cool. Okay, a couple of words that we need to learn here. Constrained means forced. So when it says the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause, it means that they had to pause. The sound of the notes of the grandfather clock chiming were so strange and peculiar that they actually couldn't keep playing their instruments. It made them It forced them. Probably would be like a discord, a sound that ruins the music so much that they don't know how to keep playing. Another one is evolutions. That was the one I messed up. Evolutions are twirling motions. So when it says that the dancers are performing evolutions, it's kind of like revolutions, except for I think it means step by step through the dance. First you do this kind of a move, and then you do that kind of a move, and then you do that kind of a move. So they were in the middle of their dance, and they're progressing through the steps. And then suddenly they had to stop as well, the dancers, because there was such a strange feeling. And then the last one is disconcert. And when you create a disconcert, that means that well, the words are a worried disturbance, but that means that people suddenly become afraid and uncomfortable and nervous by the sound of the clock. It makes everybody in the room feel the same way, kind of creepy. Okay, so the first question, and these questions on this one were not very good questions actually. I think I'm going to rewrite them for next year. But what does the voice, the narrator of the poem, focus on? Oops, I'm sorry. After reading the poem, don't forget the introduction and the glossary. What might the tolling of the clock represent? Okay, so I'll give you a pause for a second to think about that. Okay, so the tolling of the clock, we know that it creates a disconcerted feeling for everybody. It creates this creepy, uncomfortable moment where everybody sort of stops and freezes and looks at each other awkwardly. That's how the author describes it.